On the morning of August 14, 1937, deputies in Clay County, Kentucky, arrived at a weather-beaten farmhouse off a road that barely appeared on the county map. According to official logs, they had come in response to a missing persons complaint, but what they found beneath the warped floorboards was not simply a body. It was a bride, still in her wedding dress, her skeletal frame bound in a burial that was never registered, never recorded, and for decades never spoken of. In a penciled margin note, written faintly on the back of the coroner's form, one word appears beside the name of her supposed husband: brother. No signature, no acknowledgement, only that single word left like a smudge on history. The surviving fragments of the county record file are unnerving in their detachment. The typed entry lists only her first name, and even that is incomplete, the last 3 letters burned away in the courthouse fire of 1956. A supplemental note from the sheriff's office mentions, next of kin not notified, an odd phrase given that kin was the one who stood at the altar with her. And then there is the testimony of an unnamed deputy, preserved in a 1948 State Archive report. I swear she looked like she'd been buried in the same house she was born in. The walls had seen her first breath and her last. But this was no ordinary crime. This was a story that belonged to a family who never left the mountains, whose name had been repeated in whispers at back porch gatherings and family reunions, a name that now carried with it the weight of something forbidden, something carried out under the pretense of sacred duty. Neighbors described the family's land as cursed, though few dared explain why. Local clergy would only mutter that some unions were never meant to be. Even now, in sealed journals tucked away in church basements, references surfaced to a doctrine of blood that blurred the line between scripture and sickness. The 1937 discovery was enough to warrant state investigation, but somehow it never reached beyond the county line. Newspaper clippings from that month make no mention of a body, no obituary, no wedding announcement. What should have been an outrage capable of drawing national attention vanished into silence. And the silence itself became its own kind of evidence, as if a whole community conspired to bury not just the girl but the memory of her existence. Later, in 1973, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky uncovered a field journal belonging to a midwife who had served the Valley families during the 1920s and 30s. In one chilling passage dated just 2 weeks before the bride's death, she wrote, "They come to me with children that are two alike. Brothers wed sisters. I am told not to speak, not to leave notes, but I write this because I cannot watch the same bones repeat themselves in every crib." Within a year, the student who discovered the journal abandoned her research entirely, stating in a letter to her advisor, "The family is still here. They know I asked. They don't want their story written." Was this madness? Was it a form of religious conviction pushed into grotesque extremes by poverty and isolation? Or was it something deeper, a generational conditioning that took root in the shadowed corners of the Appalachian hollers, where silence was survival and tradition outweighed morality? These are the questions that linger, questions no one dared ask aloud while the family still lived behind their locked doors, and questions we are only beginning to uncover now as the last of their records surface. And yet, what remains most disturbing is not the fact of the marriage itself but the deliberate way it was concealed. Someone, sheriff, pastor, or patriarch, chose to erase it. Someone destroyed the names, the photographs, the paper trail. And yet they failed to burn every page. Enough fragments survived to hint at a truth that is far more terrifying than any rumor whispered in the hills. The bride, whose face is lost to us, became less a person and more a symbol of what happens when a community decides that keeping bloodlines pure is more important than protecting the innocent. She is a ghost that belongs not just to one farmhouse but to the entire Appalachian spine, a figure whose silence demands to be broken even now. And so we begin here with the unearthed body of a young woman who should have lived a simple life, but instead was forced into a ritual that blurred the sacred and the profane. Her story is not simply hers. It is the story of a family erased from public record, of a town that colluded in secrecy, and of a history that was meant never to be told. But it will be told. Because every hidden file, every scorched corner of a county ledger, every fading family rumor is a thread in the fabric of something much larger, something that cannot be explained away as madness alone. If you've ever heard the surname spoken in your family, if your grandmother told you not to ask about a bride who never came home, if your blood runs from these mountains and you recognize the silence that surrounds certain stories, then write it below. Let it be known. Because every comment brings another file to light. And subscribe because this story was never meant to survive, and tomorrow even this video might vanish like the rest of the records. The bride's story cannot be understood without first understanding the land that held her captive. Clay County in the 1930s was a place almost forgotten by the outside world, a hollow carved into the Appalachian spine where roads ended in clay mud and streams cut deeper into the earth than maps cared to record. The town that lay nearest to the farmhouse never appeared on official state maps after 1940, as if its existence was too small, too inconsequential to acknowledge. Yet for the families who lived there, cut off from the modern world, isolation was not an accident. It was the air they breathed, the soil they depended on, and the trap they could never escape. Once, this part of Kentucky had thrived on coal. The mines promised wages and the railroad lines promised a way out. But by the late 1920s, the seams were drying up. Companies abandoned their investments, leaving behind shafts that collapsed in silence and mountains blackened by the waste of an industry that never intended to stay. By the time the bride was born, the mine was already sealed, and the men of the town were reduced to scratching at barren soil or turning to moonshine to keep families fed. Poverty here was not just an economic condition, it was a generational inheritance, a shackle passed down like the land deeds themselves. The geography deepened the prison. Hills rose sharp and steep, blocking sunlight by mid-afternoon, while narrow creeks flooded with each heavy rain, cutting families off from one another for weeks at a time. To travel to the county seat meant hours on foot, often across trails that no cart could pass. Stories circulated of women giving birth unattended because the doctor could not reach them in time, of fevers burning through children before medicine arrived. When survival itself was in doubt, tradition became law, and families turned inward, binding themselves closer and closer until their circles were too tight to break. This was the soil in which the bride's marriage took root, a soil fed by hunger, by fear of outsiders, by a belief that blood was all one could trust when the outside world had abandoned you. Census data from 1910 and 1920 shows the same surnames repeating, often clustered in a single hollow, sometimes spelled differently but clearly belonging to the same line. Ashcrofts, Pritchards, Whitlocks, families who rarely left and even more rarely allowed new names to enter. When a mine collapsed or a road washed away, the town did not rebuild. It simply turned further inward, cutting off one more tie to the world beyond the ridges. Oral histories from the Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s describe these communities in guarded tones. One interviewer wrote, "They live by their own rules. Outsiders are seen as intruders. The hills keep secrets, and those secrets are older than the coal." Though the note was filed under cultural observations, it reads now like a warning, a recognition that the mountains did not just isolate families, but fostered a kind of law that answered only to itself. Even the church, the one institution that usually connected remote towns to the broader world, served only to deepen the separation. Services were led not by ordained pastors but by family elders, who preached from Bibles scribbled with annotations. These sermons twisted scripture into justification for whatever rules the family deemed necessary to survival. Marriage records filed with the county clerk vanish abruptly after 1925, replaced instead with home-drawn certificates that rarely listed witnesses outside the family. What began as necessity hardened into doctrine, and what should have been condemned as unnatural was instead sanctified as pure. The bride's town was not unique in Appalachia, but it was extreme. Economic collapse, geographical imprisonment, and a culture of silence created conditions where the unthinkable became possible. When no new blood entered the hollow, bloodlines folded back on themselves, and kinship blurred into something darker. A neighbor from a nearby valley interviewed decades later recalled, "They didn't let girls marry out. They said it was to keep the land in the family, but we all knew what it meant." And yet, perhaps the most haunting aspect of the town was its vanishing. By the 1960s, maps no longer marked its name, and postal routes bypassed it entirely. The town dissolved into memory, its houses rotting into the earth, its fields overtaken by thistle and briar. The land itself seemed to conspire in burying the evidence. Yet every so often, a record emerges. A census sheet, a property deed, a court fine for illegal liquor. Enough to prove that this place was not simply folklore but a living, breathing community that disappeared because it chose to disappear. This was the stage upon which the bride's life unfolded. A valley where poverty was destiny, where outsiders were enemies, and where silence was law. It was not just a town left behind by the modern world, it was a town that turned its back on the world entirely, convinced that survival depended on keeping its blood, its land, and its secrets all to itself. And so when the deputies pulled back those floorboards in 1937, they were not simply uncovering a crime. They were prying into the secret heartbeat of a town that had long ago decided it would rather devour itself than allow outsiders to dictate its future. The bride's death was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of a valley left behind, a valley that believed its silence was stronger than the law. To understand the bride, we must look into the family that bore her, a lineage that threads itself through fragments of censuses, jail ledgers, and half-burned records. They were not unique among the hollows of Kentucky, but what makes their story so disturbing is the way they seem to vanish from official history, as though someone deliberately erased them, leaving only slivers that demand to be pieced together. The 1910 census lists a household with 12 members, all bearing the same surname, a name that does not appear anywhere else in the county that year. At first glance, nothing seems unusual. A father listed as a farmer, his wife a homemaker, and their children, ranging from toddlers to young adults. But look closer and the strangeness emerges. The father and mother are marked as being the same age, though one entry is clearly corrected from a younger figure. Several children are recorded as niece or nephew rather than son or daughter, yet they share the same last name. By the 1920 census, the household is smaller, but the relationships blur further. The categories are scratched out, rewritten, sometimes left blank. Court records from 1923 note an arrest, one of the brothers charged with moonshining. The sheriff's ledger records his release on bail with the signature of W. Bridegroom, a name that seems invented, scrawled as if mocking the process. The fine was never paid, and the ledger entry is crossed through with red ink. No further mention of the brother exists in the county's legal archives. It is as if the family had learned how to vanish from the system whenever it threatened to close in on them. The local schoolhouse, one of the few institutions keeping written accounts in those years, lists children from the family sporadically. In 1928, 5 siblings appear on the roster, but their names never repeat after 1930. Teachers noted absences, illnesses, and strange behaviors. One margin note in 1929 reads, "The children all look alike, two alike. Eyes pale, hair thin, bodies frail. I fear for their health." By 1932, the teacher herself had resigned, her resignation letter citing family interference as her reason for leaving the hollow. Even newspapers, when they dared to speak of the family, did so obliquely. A 1928 clipping from the Harlan Daily Enterprise contains a single sentence buried in the back pages. Rumors persist of a wedding too close for comfort in the hills west of Clay County. No names are given, no locations described, and yet locals would later claim they knew exactly which family was meant. Within weeks of publication, the journalist who wrote the line transferred to another county, his byline never appearing in the local paper again. By the time the bride was born, the family was already marked by a pattern of concealment. They married without county approval, buried without proper death certificates, and baptized children in streams instead of churches. Oral testimonies gathered decades later speak of family elders, who kept their own hand-drawn family tree on parchment hidden in a wooden chest, refusing to let outsiders see it. One local, interviewed in 1982, remembered, "They said the tree was sacred. They said no new branch could be grafted unless it grew from the root itself. Outsiders didn't belong." This belief in purity, in blood as a form of sacred inheritance, was not entirely uncommon in isolated pockets of Appalachia. Families clung to each other for survival, wary of letting strangers into their land or their lineage. But here, in this family, the doctrine hardened into something extreme. When census takers came, relationships were falsified. When ministers visited, the family closed their doors. And when children were born with features that marked them as too closely related, those children often disappeared from the record altogether. By 1940, the family name no longer appeared on the census rolls at all. Neighbors insisted they still lived there, their chimney smoke rising through the trees, their fields still showing furrows of cultivation, but on paper they had ceased to exist. The family that once filled a farmhouse with 12 bodies became ghosts within the bureaucratic system, erased deliberately or hidden behind false names. It is within this silence that the bride's story emerges. She was part of a lineage that the government forgot or perhaps chose not to remember. A family that refused the outside world until the only blood left to mingle was their own. A family that saw kinship not as danger but as duty, twisting scripture to bless what should have been condemned. The bride did not choose her marriage. She was born into it, bred into it, and bound to it by a family who believed that the walls of their hollow were higher than the law, stronger than morality, and older than time itself. And so, when the deputies pried open the farmhouse floorboards in 1937, they did not just uncover a victim. They uncovered the buried history of a family that had spent decades perfecting the art of erasure. A family who existed everywhere in whispers and nowhere in official records. A family who taught their children that the only blood worth trusting was the blood they already shared. The bride was one of them. And because her name was erased, because her birth certificate never existed, and because her grave marker has long since disappeared, she has become something else entirely. Not just a forgotten daughter of a forgotten family, but the embodiment of how silence itself can become a weapon, and how generations can be conditioned to believe that secrecy is salvation. Every family builds its identity on belief, and in the hills of Appalachia, belief often meant survival. Churches were more than sanctuaries. They were the only institutions that carried structure into communities abandoned by the outside world. But for the bride's family, the church was not a place of salvation. It was a place where scripture was rewritten, where rituals were bent into shapes that justified what the outside world would have called unforgivable. The Hollow's only church sat at the bottom of a valley, a clapboard building with whitewashed walls and a steeple that had long since rotted through. Officially, it was listed as Independent Baptist, though no ordained pastor ever visited. Instead, elders of the family led the services, standing before a hand-hewn pulpit, holding a Bible that bore more pencil marks than printed words. Those who later glimpsed its pages described entire verses struck out, others rewritten in cramped handwriting along the margins. One psalm had been altered so completely that it no longer resembled scripture at all, reading instead like a commandment to preserve the blood of the root against all intrusion. According to fragments of oral history, children were brought into that church basement for discipline, not prayer. A notebook found decades later in the archives of a nearby seminary included what appeared to be confiscated punishment logs, entries describing beatings for speaking with strangers, for wandering to another family's home, and most disturbingly, for refusing the match. Each entry bore a child's first name, then a mark beside it, sometimes a check, sometimes a cross. No explanation was ever given for what those symbols meant. The rituals surrounding marriage were equally distorted. Witnesses who escaped the valley told of ceremonies held at dusk, when families gathered by lamplight in the church basement. There were no county licenses, no signatures, only an elder speaking the vows aloud, binding the bride and groom in front of kin and no one else. The hymns sung were not the traditional ones. Survivors remembered a single repeated verse, not found in any hymnal, urging that blood must return to blood. In these ceremonies, the bride often wore white, but the veil was not store-bought. It was a piece of linen torn from her mother's gown, passed down like an heirloom, fraying with each generation. Children were raised in this atmosphere of secrecy and submission. A surviving field journal from a missionary who briefly lived in the county in 1935 contains a chilling note. The children chant verses not of the Bible but of their father's law. They fear leaving the valley more than they fear God. The missionary's notes end abruptly after that entry. He left the county within months, never to return. Punishment itself was ritualized. If a child disobeyed or attempted to flee, they were made to kneel in the church basement, surrounded by elders who recited their rewritten verses aloud. Oral tradition suggests that these punishments could last hours, sometimes days, with children left fasting in the dark until they submitted. One witness described the basement as a place where the walls still echo with hymns that were never meant to be sung. The family's belief system hardened into doctrine precisely because no one challenged it. Isolation bred authority, and authority sanctified itself with scripture. By the time the bride stood at her brother's side, the family had convinced themselves that what they were doing was not sin but sacred duty. They had written themselves into a closed loop of faith, where every word of warning from the outside world was dismissed as temptation, and every verse of scripture was bent to justify the cycle of silence and repetition. Artifacts of this twisted faith still surface. In 1987, a group of college researchers exploring abandoned churches in eastern Kentucky stumbled upon the Hollows Chapel. They photographed carvings etched into the pulpit, not crosses but interlocked circles, symbols they later traced to old fertility cults. Pages of hymnals lay scattered across the floor, each page bearing the same handwritten phrase, "We return to the root." Within weeks of their discovery, the researchers reported being followed by strangers in the county. Two abandoned their study entirely, warning others not to investigate. Perhaps the most unsettling piece of evidence comes from a faded photograph discovered in the county archives during a file transfer in the 1990s. It shows a wedding ceremony held in the basement of that church, the faces of the participants blurred by time and light, but the positioning unmistakable. A young woman, thin and pale, standing beside a man who appears several years older. The inscription on the back, written in pencil, reads only, "Her brother." This doctrine, this merging of scripture and secrecy, became the foundation upon which the bride's fate was built. She did not simply marry her brother because of poverty or lack of options. She married him because a whole system of belief told her she must. Because the only hymn she ever heard told her blood must bind to blood. Because the only authority she ever knew was her family's twisted version of the Bible, a book rewritten until it no longer carried salvation, only submission. And so the bride's wedding was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of years of conditioning, of rituals performed in dim basements, of verses rewritten to sanctify silence. In that hollow, her marriage was not a crime. It was celebrated as obedience, and obedience was the only thing her family ever demanded of her. For decades, the bride's family had perfected the art of concealment. Their names shifted through censuses like smoke. Their marriages were sealed in basements rather than courthouses. Their deaths were buried in soil rather than registered on paper. But secrecy has its limits, and in the late 1930s the outside world began to notice. It started, as so many Appalachian tragedies do, with a child. According to a faded midwife's log preserved in the Kentucky State Archive, an entry from April 1939 records the birth of an infant described simply as not right. The note continues, head small, jaw uneven, legs twisted. Parents say it is God's will, but I know the cause. The midwife, whose name is redacted in the surviving copy, had delivered dozens of children in the county. But this was different. The baby bore the unmistakable marks of bloodlines folded too many times. The midwife quietly alerted the county health office. The family's name, however, was never entered into the report. Instead, it was filed as confidential, tucked into a folder labeled congenital defects, unconfirmed. That same year, a schoolteacher newly assigned to the valley wrote letters to the county superintendent. Fragments of those letters survive, though much is scorched from the courthouse fire of 1956. One passage reads, "The children all bear resemblance, though they call one another cousins. Several cannot read, though they are of age. They sing hymns in class that I do not recognize, verses that speak of returning to the root. I fear for them." Within 6 months, that teacher resigned, citing persistent interference from the family. She left the county entirely, and her name disappears from public record. The turning point came with a death. A young woman, unnamed in official accounts but widely believed to be kin to the bride, was found drowned in the creek that cut through the hollow. Local whispers claimed she had tried to leave, had walked the trails toward the county line before being dragged back. Officially, the coroner's report lists accidental drowning. Yet the body bore bruises around the wrists, and her lungs contained both creek water and mud, suggesting she had been forced under. Her burial took place on family land with no preacher, no obituary, and no marker. But the most disturbing signal of all came in 1940, when a doctor from the county seat attempted to perform routine vaccinations in the hollow. His report, later uncovered in a forgotten health department filing cabinet, noted that several children were kept indoors unseen though their cries could be heard. Parents refused consent, citing religious objections. Household records indicate close kinship between husband and wife. The doctor wrote that he would attempt a follow-up visit. None was ever recorded. Even newspapers, usually silent when it came to the hollow, began to murmur. The Lexington Herald published a tiny clipping in August 1940 that read, "Concerns rise over peculiar practices in rural Clay County settlement. State officials decline comment." It was one sentence, buried deep inside a regional page, but it was enough to draw attention. Locals still recall how, after the clipping appeared, men in suits were seen speaking with the sheriff outside the courthouse. No official statement followed. No follow-up article ever ran. The suits left and the silence returned. Still, the cracks had formed. The family's rituals were no longer entirely hidden. Teachers, doctors, midwives, outsiders forced into their orbit, carried away fragments of the truth. Each fragment was small, but together they painted a picture too grotesque to ignore. Children born with deformities, hymns rewritten into curses, young women drowned or buried under suspicious circumstances. Perhaps the most haunting testimony comes from a diary found in 1973, written by a nurse who had served in the county during the late 1930s. In one entry, she recalls being called to tend to a woman in labor. The home was crowded with family members, all watching in silence. The woman's screams echoed through the valley, but no one moved to help. When the child was born, the nurse described its features as a mirror of the father's, though the father was her brother. She wrote, "I wanted to run. I wanted to take the child and flee. But their eyes told me, if I spoke, I would not leave this house alive." The nurse left the county the following year, abandoning her profession entirely. These events, a deformed child, a drowned woman, a nurse's testimony, represent the moments when the outside world brushed against the hollow secrets. They are the points of contact, the times when silence faltered and truth threatened to escape. And yet each time the truth was buried again, drowned in creeks, burned in courthouse fires, or lost in forgotten archives. The bride herself was part of this sequence. Her body, unearthed in 1937 beneath the farmhouse floorboards, should have been enough to bring law, outrage, and condemnation. Instead, it was absorbed into the pattern. A record half erased, a name half burned, a death reduced to whispers and rumors. She was both the first and the last to be noticed, the symbol of a family whose secrecy could not hold forever, but whose silence proved stronger than justice itself. By the early 1940s, the Hollow was marked in county files as a place not recommended for entry. Deputies stopped patrolling there. Health workers refused assignments. It became officially a void, a place erased from duty maps, left to govern itself. But unofficially, it became something worse, a place spoken of only in warnings, a valley whose very name carried dread. The outside world noticed briefly. It knocked on the door. But the door slammed shut. And in that moment, the family learned that silence, reinforced by fear, could bury even the most disturbing truth. Every story that survives the Hollow comes not from official records, but from voices that should not have spoken. Witnesses, neighbors, nurses, teachers, all of them carried fragments of what they saw, and nearly all of them either disappeared, retracted their testimony, or spent their final years insisting that some things were better left unsaid. The bride's life and death might have stayed buried forever if not for these brief flashes of honesty, brief moments when someone broke the silence before the silence swallowed them whole. The earliest known testimony comes from 1941, in the form of asylum intake notes from the Kentucky State Hospital in Lexington. A man in his 30s was admitted for hallucinations and delusions of persecution. But the notes describe something else. Patient insists he has seen a wedding in which the bride and groom were siblings. Claims to have been threatened for reporting. States that the family sings the blood hymn at night, voices overlapping in unnatural tones. The doctor's final observation is chilling. Paranoia may be rooted in reality. County of origin matches reports of consanguinity. The patient died in the asylum 3 years later, cause of death listed as pneumonia. No family ever claimed his body. Another witness was a schoolteacher, the same one who had raised concerns to the superintendent before resigning. Decades later, in a 1965 oral interview preserved at Berea College, she recalled, "They told me the children weren't mine to teach. They told me the children were for the family and the family alone. I saw girls wearing rings before their voices had even changed. I knew what it meant. I left before they made me part of it." When researchers attempted to follow up with her, they found she had stopped speaking of the Hollow entirely. Friends described her as terrified of being remembered. Then there is the account of a nurse who traveled into the valley in 1938, summoned to treat what she was told was a fever. In a letter to her sister, discovered among family papers in 1979, she wrote, "It was not fever. It was childbirth. The woman's husband was her brother. The family stood around me as I worked, and their silence was worse than shouting. I thought I would not leave alive." Weeks later, the nurse returned home but spoke little of what she had seen. By 1942, she herself vanished from record. No further employment, no marriage license, no death certificate. Only her letter survives, the single piece of evidence that she was ever there at all. Perhaps the most striking testimony comes from a surviving grandchild of the family, interviewed anonymously in 1981 by a regional folklorist. The recording, archived but never publicly released, contains the voice of a woman who grew up in the Hollow during the 1950s. Her words are halting, broken by pauses. "We didn't know it was wrong. They told us it was God's way, that outsiders would poison us, that only blood could keep us safe. When I learned the truth, I tried to leave. But my cousin, my brother, he followed me. I left anyway. I never went back." The folklorist's notes indicate that the woman refused to give her surname, and within months she moved out of state. Her trail ends in Ohio, where she lived under a married name until her death. She never allowed her children to know where she came from. What unites all these witnesses is not simply what they saw, but the consequences of speaking. The asylum patient was written off as mad. The teacher silenced herself. The nurse disappeared. The grandchild buried her own past. It is as though the family's silence reached beyond the Hollow, suffocating anyone who tried to carry its truth into the outside world. Even journalists were not immune. In 1952, a reporter from Louisville is said to have traveled into the valley after receiving anonymous letters hinting at unnatural marriages. His notes, preserved in fragments among his papers, mentioned seeing a house where windows were nailed shut and children's voices carried hymns into the night. The reporter returned to Louisville, filed no story, and died within 2 years. His colleagues later claimed he was haunted by what he had seen. The letters that lured him there were never traced. One cannot help but notice the pattern. Witnesses emerge, speak briefly, then vanish into silence, death, or madness. It is a cycle as consistent as the family's rituals themselves. Those who lived within the hollow were conditioned never to speak. Those who came from outside and saw too much were driven away or destroyed. And those rare few who managed to leave carried with them the kind of fear that makes silence seem safer than truth. The bride's name surfaces most clearly through these witnesses. Not in official records, but in whispers, in half-burned letters, in the muttered confessions of those who could not bear the weight of what they saw. She becomes visible only in the gaps where silence failed, in the brief moments when someone risked their life to speak aloud what the family worked so hard to erase. But as we piece together these fragments, one thing becomes clear. The family's silence was not simply the absence of words. It was an active force, a weapon used to erase the truth, a shadow that consumed those who stood against it. Witnesses who should have preserved history instead became its victims, their voices fading until all that remained were scattered notes and unanswered questions. What they said was horrifying enough. But what happened to them afterward, the disappearances, the madness, the sudden deaths, is perhaps the most chilling testimony of all. By the time the outside world began to sense what was happening in the hollow, forces were already in motion to erase it. The bride's death, the malformed births, the whispered accounts of incestuous unions, all of these might have become scandals large enough to bring state officials down on the valley. And yet, again and again, the story died before it could reach the public. The silencing was not coincidence. It was suppression. The first sign of it came in 1937, in the weeks following the bride's discovery. According to a county clerk's memo unearthed during an archive transfer in the 1970s, the deputy who filed the report was called into a private meeting with the sheriff and the presiding judge. Hours later, the case file was marked closed, insufficient evidence. But how can there be insufficient evidence when a body lies buried beneath a floorboard in her wedding dress, with her own brother named in the margin notes? The answer is not in the file but in the silence that followed. The deputy was reassigned, the coroner's notes vanished, and the courthouse clerk who processed the paperwork left town within months, never to return. Then came the fire. In 1956, the Clay County Courthouse burned in what was described as an electrical accident. Flames consumed decades of records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates. And yet, among the ashes, certain cabinets appeared to have been pried open before the fire reached them. Witnesses recall seeing drawers emptied of their contents, leaving only charred scraps behind. One old lawyer, interviewed in 1978, remarked, "It wasn't a fire that erased those names. It was hands." Local pastors played their role as well. In sermons from the 1940s, preserved on yellowing mimeographs, preachers warned their congregations not to gossip about the sins of others, urging silence as a form of Christian charity. Behind closed doors, however, those same preachers were approached by family elders, who insisted that God's law excused the unions. Parishioners who spoke against it found themselves shunned. One woman wrote in a letter to her cousin, "We were told not to bring it up in prayer, not to speak of it in town meetings. If we did, we would be cast out." Journalists who attempted to pry into the story met resistance from every angle. In 1940, a reporter from the Lexington Herald wrote a draft article titled, "Valley of Secrets." The piece never ran. His editor later told colleagues that the sheriff had threatened to pull all county advertising from the paper if the story was published. The draft was buried in the newspaper's internal files, rediscovered decades later, its typewritten words underlined with notes. "Too dangerous. Drop." Even state officials played their part in the cover-up. A 1941 memorandum from the Kentucky Department of Health, stamped confidential, acknowledges intermarriage of close kin in Clay County but concludes that further investigation is not recommended at this time due to community hostility. The phrase community hostility is bureaucratic shorthand for something far more sinister: threats of violence. Health workers knew they were not welcome. Deputies knew their jurisdiction ended where the hollow began. The family had carved out a kingdom of silence, and the state chose to look away rather than confront it. The suppression was not passive. It was enforced. In 1962, a local historian attempted to write a genealogy of the Valley families. He was warned repeatedly to abandon the project. His notes, preserved by his descendants, include a final entry: "The sheriff says accidents happen on those roads." He says some names don't belong in books. I believe him. Within weeks, the historian dropped his research entirely. By the 1970s, when folklorists and graduate students began probing into Appalachian's strange customs, the Hollow was already infamous among locals as a place where questions got you hurt. One researcher recalled being followed by pickup trucks for miles after asking about the family in a nearby diner. Another was told bluntly, "You won't find their names in the courthouse because the courthouse don't want them there." That's how it's always been. The suppression ensured that the bride's story, and the story of her family, never became headline news. Instead, it slipped into rumor, relegated to oral whispers and backroad warnings. The official record was scrubbed clean. No marriage licenses, no birth certificates, no death records. What remained were fragments, often mislabeled or deliberately obscured, like scars left behind by a wound someone kept reopening. And yet, this very erasure is its own kind of testimony. Silence does not erase truth, it amplifies it. Every missing page, every vanished file, every burnt ledger speaks louder than words. Someone wanted this story buried. Someone ensured that the bride's name and the names of those who followed her were wiped from history. But the mountains remember what paper does not. And when those who tried to silence the Hollow are themselves long gone, the fragments they failed to destroy remain. A penciled margin note. A burned file corner. A hymnal with rewritten verses. All evidence that, no matter how fiercely they tried, they could not silence everything. The suppression was powerful. But it was not perfect. And because of that, we are able to stand here now, piecing together the story they wanted erased, dragging it out of the silence that consumed so many voices. If the bride's family tried to erase themselves from records, the house where she lived stood as their one failure. A structure too stubborn to burn, too remote to be torn down, too saturated with memory to disappear. It sits even now, a ruin reclaimed by vines and moss, its roof sagging inward like a spine bent by age. But those who have stepped inside swear the air itself is different, heavier, charged with something that lingers. The house, they say, still carries the weight of what happened there. In 1987, 2 college students from Berea ventured into the Hollow on a folklore expedition. They had been told about the bride's place by a retired coal miner who claimed the family once worshipped in the parlor. The students hiked for hours before reaching the house, snapping Polaroids of its collapsing porch and shuttered windows. Inside, they found remnants of lives abruptly abandoned, broken furniture, a cradle carved by hand, hymnals with pages torn out. One photo shows a message scrawled into a wall beam, "Blood to blood." The handwriting is jagged, almost carved into the wood itself. The students left quickly. Weeks later, one of them withdrew from school. The other, when interviewed years later, admitted, "I don't talk about that house. I wish I'd never gone in." The house had been described before. A hunter in 1962 reported finding it while tracking deer. He claimed the upstairs floorboards creaked under his weight, though he never saw anyone inside. On a table, he said, lay a wedding veil yellowed with age, carefully folded as if waiting for another ceremony. When he left the Hollow, he swore he heard singing behind him, a woman's voice, soft and low, carrying a hymn that did not belong to any church he knew. He never returned to that ridge again. Another account comes from 1999, when hikers stumbled upon the house by accident. One of them later wrote in a journal, "We went inside. The air smelled of rot and old earth. In one corner was a child's shoe, impossibly small. Upstairs there was a locked door. We couldn't open it, but from behind it came a sound like a chair rocking." They fled before nightfall, and by morning, they swore the trail they had used to find the house no longer existed. Despite its decay, the house retains an uncanny preservation. The walls are damp, but photographs tacked to one remain intact. Blurred images of family gatherings, faces turned away from the camera, children whose eyes glint with unnatural brightness. In the kitchen, a stove rusts in place, but above it hangs a cast-iron pot blackened from endless use. Locals whisper that the pot was never meant for food, but for boiling cloth used in their rituals, cloth that bound siblings in marriage. In 2006, a paranormal research team tried to document the house, filming for a small television segment. Their footage, never aired, reportedly captured a shadow moving across a wall though no one stood in front of the light. Audio picked up a faint humming, female, melodic, rising in pitch until it broke into static. The team abandoned the project, citing technical difficulties, but one member later confided, "The static followed us home. The humming didn't stop when we left." What makes the house so disturbing is not only the physical remnants but the way it seems to resist time. Floors buckle but never collapse. Furniture rots but never fully disappears. The veil remains folded. The locked door remains locked, as if the house itself refuses to release what it holds inside. Even the land around it carries warnings. Hunters claim no birds sing near the house, no deer cross its clearing. Locals say grass grows strangely pale in the yard, and in winter the snow melts first at its doorstep, as though some hidden heat escapes from beneath. On moonlit nights, neighbors swear they've seen faint candlelight in the upstairs window, though the house has had no electricity in nearly a century. Perhaps most unsettling are the accounts of those who dream after visiting. In 1987, one of the students wrote that for weeks afterward, she dreamed of a woman in white standing at the foot of her bed, humming the same hymn she'd heard in the hollow. A hiker in 1999 reported nightmares of drowning in a creek, the bride's face pressed close to his, her mouth whispering verses he could not understand. These dreams always share the same detail: the bride never speaks aloud. Her lips move, her eyes burn pale, but her words remain lost, as if the house itself guards her final secret. The bride's body may have been buried beneath its floorboards, but her presence never left. Visitors describe the sense that the house is watching, waiting, holding its silence the way her family once did. It stands as the last monument to their existence, a structure not on any map, a place the county refuses to acknowledge, and yet the one undeniable piece of evidence that their story is not folklore but fact. The house still stands, still wrong, still carrying the echoes of hymns no one should sing and vows no one should speak. And as long as it stands, the bride's story will never vanish, no matter how many records are burned or names erased. Because some truths are etched not in paper but in wood, in stone, in the soil itself. Truths that rot but never fade, truths that silence cannot destroy. The bride's family was not alone. To treat her story as an isolated horror would be to misunderstand the way silence spreads in the mountains. Once you look closely at the records, once you pull at the fraying threads left behind, you begin to see the same knots tied again and again, in nearby hollows, in neighboring counties, across state lines. Different names, different homes, but the same rituals, the same secrecy, the same obsession with blood kept too close. School rosters from the 1920s and 30s provide some of the clearest evidence. In Clay, Harlan, and Leslie counties, names repeat across decades, children listed as cousins though they share the same household, sometimes even the same birth month. Teachers left marginal notes that mirror those written in the bride's valley. All children resemble one another, health poor, parents object to outside lessons. In one case, a teacher in Leslie County described an entire classroom singing a hymn she did not recognize, a chant of root returns to root. The phrasing was nearly identical to what witnesses later recalled hearing in the bride's hollow. Church records too carry disturbing parallels. In Perry County, a small congregation kept handwritten marriage certificates long after county licenses were required. Many of those certificates pair individuals with the same last name. One entry, dated 1924, shows a bride and groom listed as cousins. In the margin, a note in different handwriting adds, "closer than cousins." When researchers uncovered the ledger in the 1970s, several pages had been deliberately torn out, leaving gaps where marriages from the 1930s should have been recorded. Death records tell a similar story. Coroners in multiple counties reported congenital deformities in children, often with the phrase consanguinity suspected. In most cases, the names of the parents are redacted or lost in courthouse fires. Yet the pattern persists, the same surnames reappearing in clusters, often in regions with no new settlers, no outside bloodlines, no connection to the world beyond the ridges. And then there are the oral testimonies. Families who fled the mountains in the 1950s and 60s carried whispers of bad hollows, where marriage rules were different, where elders preached that God don't want the blood watered down. In interviews decades later, some still refused to name the families, fearing retribution even after generations had passed. One man interviewed in Tennessee in 1984 admitted, "It wasn't just one family. It was pockets all through the hills. You kept to your own, and if you questioned it, you didn't last long." Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence comes from a set of state medical surveys conducted in the late 1930s. Doctors sent into rural Appalachia recorded cases of genetic disorders so concentrated that they could not be explained by chance alone. Their reports mention multiple families across 3 counties exhibiting the same symptoms: brittle bones, stunted growth, pale eyes, and speech abnormalities. Yet when follow-up studies were proposed, local sheriffs and pastors intervened, warning researchers that they would not be welcome. The studies were shelved, filed away under inconclusive, and never published. Patterns also surface in folklore. Ballots collected in eastern Kentucky contain veiled references to bride and brother, to marriage bound in blood, to houses where windows never open. These songs were often sung by outsiders as cautionary tales, warnings to travelers not to wander too deep into the ridges. But within the hollows themselves, the songs were sung differently, not as warnings but as hymns, verses passed down to children as if they were sacred law. What emerges is a chilling realization. The bride's story was not an isolated tragedy but part of a wider, unspoken system. Appalachia's isolation, its collapsed economies, its roads that led nowhere, all of these conditions created fertile ground for the same rituals to take hold again and again. Families turned inward, justified their choices with twisted scripture, and silenced anyone who dared to resist. And because each hollow kept to itself, outsiders could dismiss the stories as rumors, never realizing how many valleys carried the same secret. The repetition of names is the clearest proof. In census after census, surnames like Whitlock, Pritchard, Ashcroft, and Everly appear, vanish, then reappear in different counties miles apart. Sometimes the spelling shifts slightly as if to disguise the connection, but the root remains the same. Researchers in the 1980s traced one surname across 4 counties, noting that in each, the family married within itself, left no official licenses, and buried its dead on private land. It was, as one anthropologist remarked, a genealogy written in shadows. Even modern accounts hint that the pattern has not entirely ended. A social worker in the 1990s reported visiting a remote Kentucky household where children bore strikingly similar features. When she raised concerns, she was told by her supervisor to drop it, it's cultural. The phrase echoes the same justifications given decades earlier, proof that silence still protects the old patterns. This is the horror of the bride's story, not that it happened once in one farmhouse beneath one sagging roof, but that it happened again and again in hollows scattered across Appalachia, each repeating the same rituals, each protected by silence, each vanishing from official record only to resurface years later under a slightly different name. The bride was one face of a larger truth. She was a symbol of a system that thrived on secrecy, one family among many who turned their backs on the outside world and married themselves into darkness. Her story shocks us because it is personal, because it is tied to a body pulled from beneath a floorboard. But behind her stands a pattern that suggests she was not alone, that others lived and died under the same twisted laws, their names lost but their rituals preserved. And once you recognize the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Every missing census line, every burned courthouse file, every faded obituary hints at another bride, another house, another hollow where blood returned to blood and silence buried the rest. For most people, the bride's story feels like a relic of the past, a grim fragment from the 1930s, buried under courthouse fires and fading oral accounts. It is easy to believe that what happened in that hollow could never happen again, that the rituals of blood and silence ended when the house began to collapse into the soil. But recent accounts tell a different story. They suggest that the pattern did not die. It only went quiet, waiting for another generation. In 2014, a Reddit thread appeared under the title, "Weird Wedding in the Hills." The poster claimed to have attended a rural ceremony in eastern Kentucky, invited by a college roommate whose extended family still lived deep in the mountains. According to the post, the wedding was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was held in a cabin with boarded windows, no minister officiated, and instead an elder recited vows from a hand-copied book. The bride and groom shared the same last name, and when the poster asked about it, relatives laughed and said, "It's always been that way." The thread was deleted within days, but not before screenshots spread. Locals dismissed it as a prank, but the details echoed rituals documented decades earlier. The dim cabin, the handwritten verses, the refusal to involve outsiders. Police logs also hint at the persistence of the old ways. In 2017, a deputy responding to a domestic disturbance in Breathitt County recorded an unusual detail. A child had drawn a strange symbol on the wall in charcoal, a set of interlocking circles with a cross through the center. The deputy, unfamiliar with its meaning, photographed it. When folklorists later saw the image, they recognized it instantly. The same symbol had been carved into pews and hymnals in the bride's hollow, preserved in photographs from the 1980s. A sign of the return to the root. A sign that the doctrine was alive. Social media, too, carries whispers of revival. A Facebook group dedicated to Appalachian genealogy briefly hosted a thread in 2019 where members debated whether a certain family name had married itself out of existence. Several comments mentioned the bride's hollow, noting similarities between modern family practices and older, whispered traditions. The thread vanished within hours. Moderators claimed it was too sensitive. Then there are the stories of dreams. In 2020, a woman in Hazard posted anonymously that she had been waking to the sound of a hymn in her sleep, a hymn she did not know but that she described as low, layered, voices upon voices, singing about roots. When she asked her grandmother about it, the older woman grew pale and told her never to repeat the words aloud. Days later, the post was gone. Friends claimed she had deactivated her account. More tangible accounts come from children. Teachers in several Appalachian schools have quietly reported students humming unfamiliar tunes, sketching the same interlocking circle symbol in notebooks, or referring to the bride in stories passed among themselves. One teacher, in a confidential note filed with a school counselor in 2021, wrote, "I asked a student where she heard that song. She said, 'My uncle sings it at night. He says it's for family only.'" Folklorists warn that traditions like these, once rooted, rarely vanish completely. Instead, they go dormant, hiding in memory, resurfacing when isolation deepens again. And Appalachia today is not immune to isolation. Towns continue to vanish as minds close. Roads wash out, leaving valleys cut off. Poverty lingers just as it did in the 1930s. In those conditions, the same pressures that created the bride's hollow, fear of outsiders, dependence on kin, the sanctification of secrecy, can take hold again. The return is not just about rituals. It is about names. Genealogists tracing county marriage records in the 2000s began noticing certain surnames resurfacing, names long thought extinct. In small churches tucked away on unpaved roads, those names appear on handwritten rosters. Baptism certificates list parents who share the same family tree. In some cases, the exact surname of the bride's family reappears, spelling altered but unmistakable. When pressed, pastors dismiss it as coincidence. But coincidence does not explain the repetition of symbols, songs, and rituals across generations. Some claim the bride herself has returned, not as flesh but as myth, a figure whispered to children as both warning and prophecy. In Appalachian forums, posters tell of hearing the phrase, "When the bride sings again, the bloodline is unbroken." It is said that women in certain hollows wear white veils at secret gatherings, not for weddings but as part of ceremonies meant to bind the family together. And yet, the most unsettling evidence of the return comes not from folklore but from handwriting. In 2022, a county clerk in Leslie County uncovered an unsigned marriage document tucked into the back of an old registry. The handwriting matched, almost exactly, signatures taken from the bride's court records of 1937. The ink was fresh. The page bore no date. When questioned, the clerk grew uneasy and filed it under miscellaneous. Months later, when researchers requested access, the page had vanished. The bride's hollow may be abandoned, her house collapsing, her body long decayed. But her story is not finished. It lingers in modern accounts, in symbols drawn by children, in hymns sung quietly at night, in documents that appear decades after they should. It lingers because the family or families like them never ended. They only learned to hide better. This is the true horror of the return. Not that the past repeats, but that it was never truly past at all. It only waited, patient as the mountains, waiting for the next generation to carry the silence forward. And if the hymns are being sung again, if the symbols are appearing again, then perhaps the bride was not just a victim of history. Perhaps she is a prophecy. If there is one detail that ties the bride's story to every generation that followed, it is her name. Or rather, the way her name refuses to stay buried. Names, after all, are the anchor of history. They appear on birth certificates, on gravestones, on court records. They carry memory forward. But in the case of the bride, her name is both erased and eternal, disappearing from one ledger only to reappear decades later, as though it has a will of its own. The first anomaly surfaces in the 1937 court file where deputies logged her death. Her first name is incomplete, the final letters blackened by fire. But the signature beside it, faint, pencil-thin, matches another signature found on a marriage record from 1912 in a neighboring county. Two different women, separated by a generation, signing in nearly identical strokes. Handwriting experts consulted in the 1970s called the similarity unsettling. One concluded that it was either the same hand, or a hand trained deliberately to replicate the original. Then, in 1965, during a review of state welfare cases, her name surfaced again. A custody hearing listed the mother as bearing the exact name erased from the 1937 file. The judge's notes remark, "Unusual coincidence. Name matches that of a deceased woman in Clay County. Relatives deny connection." But coincidence falters when the signature at the bottom of the 1965 document matches, almost perfectly, the one from 1937. Same loops, same slant, same pressure. Handwriting does not travel intact across decades unless it is carried intentionally. Folklorists argue that in Appalachia, names themselves hold power. To speak a name is to call it back into being. Perhaps that is why so many locals refuse to utter the bride's surname aloud. One woman interviewed in 1988 told researchers, "We don't say it because when you do, the records change. You'll look one day and it's gone, but you say the name out loud and there it is again in some other file." She refused to repeat the name even for the tape recorder. County clerks have reported similar disturbances. In 1992, a clerk in Perry County discovered that a set of property deeds bore the bride's surname, though the land had been abandoned since the 1940s. The deeds were signed in handwriting nearly identical to the earlier records. The clerk filed them under archival error, but when she checked the ledgers again weeks later, the deeds had vanished. She swore she had not misfiled them. The name was there and then it wasn't, she told colleagues. Digital records have not stopped the pattern. In 2003, an online genealogy database briefly displayed a marriage entry from 1978 linking the bride's surname to another family in West Virginia. The entry vanished within hours, though not before several researchers captured screenshots. When they returned to the site, the page had been scrubbed. The administrators insisted no such entry had ever existed. But the screenshots remain, clear proof that the name had appeared, only to rewrite itself out of history once again. Even more unsettling are the accounts of handwriting re-emerging long after its time. In 2010, a historical society uncovered a family Bible from the hollow. In its back pages, someone had written the names of marriages performed in secret ceremonies. The most recent entry was dated 1998. The name written there was the same as the bride's, and the handwriting was indistinguishable from the 1937 signature. Scholars examining the Bible remarked that the ink was fresh, the strokes confident, as if the hand had never aged. This repetition raises a question more disturbing than incest or secrecy. What if the bride's name is not just a record of a woman but a role? A title passed down, written again and again, binding generation after generation to the same ritual? The bride then would not be a single victim but an inheritance. Each time the signature reappears, each time the surname resurfaces, it signals that the pattern is continuing, that another daughter has been claimed by the same fate. Locals tell a darker version of this belief. They say the bride's name is cursed, that once it is spoken aloud in full, the speaker's own family tree will bend toward the hollow, pulling them into its cycle. One folklorist recalled an old man who refused to even write the name down, warning, "The ink won't dry right. It'll smear. It doesn't want to stay still." He was correct. In multiple archival collections, copies of documents bearing the bride's name are smudged, blurred, or missing letters, as if the paper itself resists preserving it. This is why researchers whisper that the bride's story rewrites itself. Not because history has forgotten her, but because the name itself refuses to die. It returns in every generation, in court cases, in family Bibles, in online databases that vanish overnight. Always the same name. Always the same handwriting. And so the bride becomes less a figure of history than a ghost in the archive. A presence that refuses to be erased, a name that insists on reappearing no matter how many times it is burned, drowned, or hidden. Speak it aloud and the records shift. Whisper it and it writes itself again. The bride is not just memory. She is repetition. And repetition is the most horrifying truth of all. The bride's story is not one we were meant to know. Every record points to erasure. Names burned in courthouse fires, census lines struck through, notes scribbled and crossed out. Every witness who spoke disappeared, silenced by fear or madness. Every artifact, the hymnals, the family Bible, the photographs, surfaces only briefly before vanishing back into locked drawers or private archives. And yet, enough fragments survive to piece together what the family, the town, and even the state tried to bury. Enough remains to see the outline of the truth. In the Kentucky State Archives, a single file sits under the label "Closed, Confidential." Inside is a half-burned page stamped with the year 1937. At the top is a name, letters smeared and blackened, impossible to read in full. At the bottom is a map coordinate that does not resolve to any current road or property. Archivists admit the file should not exist. When researchers request it, they are often told it has been misplaced. Yet somehow, when one insists, the file reappears, charred at the edges, the ink faint but unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly, it is gone again. Those who have seen the file describe the same detail, a line scrawled in pencil across the margin. It reads, "The bride remains." No one can explain who wrote it or when. Some claim it was added years later, others insist it was always there. What matters is that it confirms what the records, the folklore, and the whispers all suggest. The bride is not a person locked in the past, but a presence that lingers in the present, repeating itself through every generation. Researchers who dare to trace the surname find the same thing. The moment you write it down, it begins to surface. In census records, in property deeds, in online genealogies that weren't there the day before. The more you look, the more it appears until you realize the name is not being discovered, it is rewriting itself in front of you. Speak it aloud and the archive shifts. Type it and new entries appear. Stop searching and it disappears again. As though the bride herself decides when to be seen. And then there is the house. Still standing. Still wrong. The one undeniable piece of evidence that cannot be burned or erased. A house where floorboards once hid a bride's body. A house where hymns were sung in secret. A house where visitors in 1987, 1999, and 2006 all described the same sound. A woman humming from behind a locked door. The house endures because it carries what paper cannot. Memory carved into beams, into stone, into the soil itself. Memory that resists silence. This is the horror. Not simply that the bride was forced into a marriage with her brother, not that she died under floorboards, not that her family perfected the art of erasure. The true horror is that the silence worked. For nearly a century, her story was hidden in margins, whispered in nightmares, smudged from ledgers. And yet, silence cannot hold forever. Because silence itself leaves scars. Scars that show in missing names, in burned files, in families who refuse to speak. What are we to make of this? Was it madness? Was it generational conditioning? Was it the natural consequence of poverty and isolation, or the deliberate perpetuation of a belief system twisted into something monstrous? The truth may never be fully known. But we know this much. Her name continues to surface. Her hymns continue to echo. Her house continues to stand. The bride remains. And so we end where we began, with a story pulled from fragments, pieced together against the will of those who tried to erase it. With a name that writes itself back into history no matter how many times it is struck out. With a valley where silence became a weapon and obedience became law. With a body buried beneath the floorboards, a veil folded neatly in a locked drawer, and a voice that still hums in the dark. If you recognize this story, if the surname sounds familiar, if your grandmother ever warned you not to ask about the house at the end of a forgotten road, then you are part of it. If you have ever dreamed of hymns you should not know, if you have ever seen the symbol of interlocking circles carved into wood, if you have ever found a name in your family Bible that seems to appear and vanish, then the silence is not finished with you. Write it below. Let us see what they tried to erase. Because every comment brings another file to light. And subscribe, because even this video might vanish tomorrow, pulled back into the silence that has buried so many voices before. You weren't meant to know this, but now you do. And once you know, you cannot unsee.